recommendations. We have to hope that we did a good job, enough job really advocating for people's needs and explaining different things in a way that the capitalists, the ruling class, will want to buy into it. It's not about the public good, it's about what will make more people money. And additionally, so there's something called maximum feasible participation, which is basically an excuse for the ruling class to say we don't really need to do public engagement in city planning. We will do the maximum feasible participation that we can try to do, and then we think that's enough. That's essentially really all it is. And I would argue that that's actually an excuse or a way to really minimize participation so that they don't get people involved in the public process for planning and like actually being involved in the decision making of how our communities operate. Planning under socialism would be very different. It would use a mixed approach of both top down and bottom up. We would have national agencies that set broad policies, but then regional and local agencies to make the decisions on the ground. And this would be in cooperation with popular organizations. So organizations made of the people on the ground, cooperatives, citizens assemblies, unions, neighborhood councils. These types of popular organizations would actually be at the forefront of making decisions about how our communities are developed and planned. And then this top-down and bottom-up approach allows for intervention at any level if we find that plans conflict with people's collective interests. It's very easy, people have different interests. If we don't allow for really flexible intervention, then it could be very easy to move away from the collective interests. And so that's why planning under socialism will be much more flexible and participatory, including everybody in the process, including the popular organizations, not just agencies deciding for us what will happen, and then politicians deciding if they think they'd like to implement it or not. So I'm also going to talk a bit about housing and transportation. For some quick statistics, in the United States, there's 3.5 million homeless people and 17 million vacant housing units. In Philadelphia, there are about 4,500 homeless people and over 130,000 vacant housing units. Half of all renters in the United States are housing insecure. This is about 54% in Philadelphia. So if any sort of emergency happens, you lose your job, anything goes wrong, medical emergency, if you can't pay for your housing, it takes up too much of a percentage of your income, you could easily be evicted and lose the roof over your head. And we also understand that housing is very inadequate and unhealthy, and that this is much worse for Black and Brown communities, LGBTQ communities, seniors, and people with disabilities. There's a lot of housing sites are located by toxic sites. There's issues inside of people's homes, asbestos, lead, mold, other poor quality building on newer homes as well, just to really save costs on things. And so because profit is put before people currently, the housing does not actually meet our needs, and it's very unsafe in many situations. Under socialism, we would put that need first. What do the people need? What do people need to be safe to live in their house? And so just some examples of how these different housing developments and putting profits over people have impacted Philadelphia. For example, in Chinatown, a number of developments have just slowly decreased the size of this ethnic neighborhood, one of the first and strongest Chinatowns still in a city in America, cutting it completely in half with I-76, putting up the gallery, the mall, and the convention center, all completely just making the community smaller and smaller, forcing these people into a different, smaller area so that bigger interests can make money off of it. And then we've also seen in West Philadelphia, which was dubbed University City. So a lot of the corporations there, the universities, the hospitals, and other corporations actually joined together and made this group that they wanted to call themselves University City. And so they started to purchase properties and then deliberately let them fall into disrepair so that they could lower the housing values of the entire neighborhood, and then continue to buy up properties at a cheaper price so that they could essentially own all of West Philadelphia. And that's something that we're still seeing today with University City and these big corporate interests. So this is what happens when we're putting profit when we put profit over people. Under socialism, housing would be completely different. We would have a national housing agency with the immediate priority to end homelessness and housing insecurity. Some immediate steps we would take are seizure of all vacant units and make them into public housing. We can very easily house all of the people that don't have homes right now with the units that already exist. It doesn't make sense to have housing units to be vacant. They'll just fall into disrepair anyways. We're going to forgive all the mortgage debt so that people can actually own their homes instead of the bank owning their homes. And we would reduce rent and make options for rent to own, making it so, it's not just a house that you bounce around between, but you have a house that you are growing with and you love and that you want to own, and it's not like an investment, but it's a home. Everyone needs a home, and so additionally, there would be comprehensive housing plans to ensure the abolition of structural racism. So after these immediate priorities, we need to take some really big looks at how housing works in the United States. We need to eliminate segregation, environmental racism, address sprawl. There's lots of issues like Black and brown communities have absence of green spaces. There's not enough shade trees, different things like this that have been the communities have been deliberately developed these ways, and we see where the issues are, so we can immediately intervene and make the changes that we know that we need for the people. And then there's also an urgent need for reparations after decades of redlining and deprivation of resources to our communities. It's just incredibly essential that we take this step in addition to just having housing security for all. And then additionally, we would address long-term issues related to climate change, which Echo will talk about more. But yeah, just like understanding that about how energy efficiency, floodplain issues, and other disasters that people are facing, how we can keep them safe in their homes while these things are happening. We know that the climate is changing and we need to act now so that we can actually give people what they need and stay secure in their homes. And then I just want to talk about an example of this, of what this would look like in Philly. So we know there's a lot of issues with people who have lead pipes in their homes. And so this is very interesting. The city's piping and water infrastructure has actually all been replaced recently enough or was never built with lead in the first place. So the city's pipes themselves are not the issue when it comes to lead. But the problem is that the pipes connecting the city's pipes to people's homes are often these lead pipes. They're incredibly expensive just to even look in to see if it is made with lead, and it's incredibly expensive to replace. So most homeowners just don't look into it to begin with, because if you ignore it, then if it is found that it's made of lead, you must replace it. It's a requirement. So people just don't look into it so they don't have to make the expense. Under socialism, it would be completely different. We would have a program that we would just identify all the houses that have lead pipes, and then we would go and replace them. Obviously, it would take a little bit of time, but we would just do the process of doing that. And I mean, even today or yesterday, President Biden introduced a program specifically addressing lead pipes in homes in Philadelphia. But this is, it would be a program that people have to apply for and get a grant for, and hopefully, it's seen that their need is big enough for them to be a part of this program. Under socialism, it would be just everybody, we do a comprehensive check. Do you have lead pipes in your home? We'll fix them. Just doing what needs to be done to save the people. And then finally, just want to talk a little bit about transportation. So the transportation network was really created to bring people to work and to move products to markets where people will buy them. And this national transportation network is widely car dependent, which comes with costs, dangers, impacts to the climate, community disruption as we raise down people's homes to build more roads, different things like that. And so we're forced to make hard trade-offs between cost, time, and safety. And also we know that public transportation is incredibly underfunded in the United States. The funding cuts in the 70s actually forced a lot of transportation providers to privatize and turn into profit-seeking entities. And that has made it so that a lot of transportation providers are very inadequate. They're not able to provide the services that people actually need. And just to speak to how the federal government is undercutting this issue, in 2021, about $19 billion was given to the transit administration, the Federal Transit Administration, while about $63 billion were given to the Highway Administration, which is what looks at our interstate roads, renewing highways, bridges, different things like that. So it's just the fact that less than a third of that amount of money is going to transit, public transportation. We know why it's so bad. And then we also understand the places where people are forced to take transit are highly policed, especially for Black and Brown communities. We need to take over our transportation systems for the people and make them so they serve us. They have to be safe, they have to be clean, they have to be on time, all of these things. And they can't be, policing is the answer to that. And then finally, all these modes rely heavily on oil. We know that greenhouse gas emissions are a huge issue with this, but then additionally, control over oil markets and the drive for US imperialism has killed and injured countless people just for this, so that we can continue to drive our cars. That the federal government is trying to make it so we continue to drive these cars instead of taking public transit. And really, this is also a theft of our time. When we design communities so that our work, our home, our doctor's office, everything is in a different location. Now it's more theft of our time having to go between all these locations instead of just designing a community for people so they can get what they need. They have things in walking distance, all those types of things. Transportation under socialism would be very different. We would obviously move a lot of investment into public transportation, and public transportation would immediately be made free. There would be improvements to routes and schedules to actually meet people's needs. And like I said before, it would be in coordination with these popular organizations to figure out what are the routes and schedules that people need, not just someone doing a study in a room and figuring out what they think is the need. And also we'd be planning and implementing safe street designs, looking at slowing down cars, making wider sidewalks, making it so it's safe for all of us to use the roads, people on bikes, walking, or in the vehicle. Oh, and we would develop plans for high-speed electrified rail network between major population centers. So a lot of really good stuff, trying to end the reliance on the private car. And like I said, this is all stuff that doesn't happen overnight, but we do understand these steps need to be taken to save the environment and to save the world and to make all of our lives just that much more dignified, easier to live. Yeah, all of these things. Very excited for them to happen eventually. But yeah, basically, to sum it all up, planning today is only it's to put profits over people. It's to make more money for the ruling class. It's not actually to build the things that we need or to connect us to the things that we need as people. But under socialism, when we put the people over profits, it would be completely turned around. It wouldn't be immediate changes. We understand these are very difficult things that take time to work on. But the changes would be profound because it would be putting the people first instead of seeking out more profit from the people.
Hi everyone. As Nana said, I'm Kasturi. Thank you, Naz, for introducing us. Thank you, Bianca, for that lovely talk. And I'm here today to talk about what policing and public safety is going to look like in a socialist world. Let me start by saying very briefly what it looks like right now. Now, as a public defender in Philadelphia, over 90% of my clients were Black or Hispanic. We represent either us or our conflict counsel. So when our office is a conflict and can't represent someone, between the two of us, we represent 80% of everyone coming through the criminal justice system, anyone charged with a crime, misdemeanor onwards, including DUIs. Now, I want you guys to think about that for a second. To be considered indigent to qualify for a court-appointed counsel, it's a very low bar. You know, it's tied to the federal poverty rate. It's nothing. We are overwhelmingly prosecuting the working class and our Black and brown populations. Who we're not prosecuting are folks committing the truly consequential, vast-scale financial crimes. You know, when the Wall Street bailout happened in 2008, one person went to jail for 30 months, and that was it. So obviously this system is completely broken. Certain things that should be criminal are not a crime. Like, it's not a crime to not pay your workers a living wage. Now, the minimum wage is so far below that. Forget like having the worker share in the profit that the worker is helping create. Don't even have to pay them living wages. Banks get bailed out. That's like a wholesale loot of our taxpayer money, right? That's completely legal. Most recently, if rail workers strike, the Biden administration and Congress steps up to the mantle to force them to accept terms that are clearly completely inhumane. So this legal system doesn't work for us. We need to be able to conceptualize an alternative that is radically from the top down as well as the bottom up, different. So I'm going to start with a quote from the Socialist Reconstruction text that says that, well, firstly, the policing as we know it is going to be abolished. And what this government will do is replace all capitalist institutions with new institutions built from the ground up to truly serve and defend the vast majority, the working class and the oppressed. The new rule of law will value personhood over property. So what this means is a new legal code organized around principles of accountability, where we center the needs of the victim and the community most affected. So first off, the easy one, which is a really large chunk of common crimes as we think of them today, or survival crimes, economic crimes, those will be dramatically reduced fairly quickly. You know, if you're not fighting for your basic human rights, if you have access to food, shelter, public transportation, education, healthcare, childcare, then you don't need to resort to the streets to try to make ends meet, right? So that will be a sort of first step measure. It will become illegal to use police force or threaten to use police force to evict anybody, to push anybody into houselessness. The war on drugs. I think we all know that the war on drugs doesn't really work and has quite the opposite effect, which you could say it was designed to do. It's a bit of a false, like an oxymoron. But it should be treated as a health issue, as it should have from the beginning. Now, one of the things this book recommends is that possession, simple possession of drugs should no longer be a crime. Now, in Philadelphia, to an extent, that's already been the case since Larry Krasner became the DA. It can definitely be made more robust. So now if you are arrested just for simple possession, they tend to withdraw the charges or give you like a few months to be on some sort of conditional probation before they withdraw it. However, if you're charged with any other crime, then they want to go to trial or get a conviction on that as well. So we need to do away with that piece. You know, obviously we need better, more adequate and more voluminous treatment facilities that are actually providing the long-term care that people need and not just revolving them in and out the door. We need more safe needle exchange programs. I know that is a hotly contested issue here in Kensington, but I think anyone in the healthcare field trying to provide treatment will tell you that that is absolutely essential. And then, so that's more like at the granular level, but the 10,000 feet view is a socialist government will stop all the CIA right-wing coups all over the world. You know, the Pentagon stops destabilizing entire regions of the world for oil and whatever else exploitation they have in mind, then that will stop like the drug trade from flourishing in different parts of the world and flooding our markets. And also, in a socialist world, in a socialist United States, we won't have these large private banks siphoning off cartel money in all manner of accounts and protecting them. So when you cut off the drug supply, that is like a larger, more longer term view of solving this problem. It won't be quick, but it can be done, and it's very achievable. And lastly, drug manufacturers, pharmaceutical manufacturers, like that will be nationalized and supervised by the socialist government. So drugs will be free, and they will only come to market to promote the health of the people. We think of the Sackler family and OxyContin and what they did and how they didn't serve a day in jail. Well, all of that will be a thing of the past. Next, to deal with violent crimes, a socialist model will embody participatory public safety. So what does that look like? A majority of the people will be involved in activities in their communities that will deter and interrupt social conflict. This will be done with a focus towards promoting public health and to conflict resolution. So the reliance will be on relationship building rather than brute force. And we already see this. I think all of us know here, the safest communities are tightly knit, well-resourced, and with the least policing. And we need to get there for everybody. And so one of the ways that this happens is through violence intervention, where members from the community are going out into the community to talk to people as soon as there's like a whiff of some shooting or violence that is about to break out, or if that's not possible, then right after there is a shooting, because that is when the community is at highest risk for a retaliatory shooting from the victim's friends or family. So they go in there, and these are often, former gang members themselves, formerly incarcerated people with a lot of credibility in the community, and engage in conflict de-escalation techniques and mediation techniques, and try to get this to stop. There's already a blueprint for this in Philadelphia. It is the ceasefire program that is part of something called the Cure Violence model, which is a global project, and it works out of Temple. I don't know too much about it, but I do know that out of all the programs that I've heard of in my time at the PD, this is the one that we have the most respect for. So every other program is a carrot and stick approach, a partnership with the Philly Police Department, where it's like, here's all these services we're hooking you up to, but you make one false step and we're gonna ask for double the sentence we would for a normal person because you, my friend, are high risk. Now, when I started out as a public defender in South Philadelphia, the pilot program was focused deterrence. That was its name. All but one of the youth identified for this program were Black. And they just went after them with the most horrific sentence recommendations and whatnot to the judge. So what we do not want is a carrot and stick approach. The only thing that works is carrot and carrot. I mean, the ceasefire program, they're not in partnership with the police. They have the community people going in to do the conflict resolution work that I just talked about. And for high-risk individuals, they are assigned a caseworker who provides them mentoring and meets with them multiple times a week and tries to connect them to services. But there's nothing punitive about any of this. And I mean, they have a pretty robust set of criteria for how somebody can get selected for this program. They have to meet 4 of the 7 following criteria. 1, gang involvement. 2, to be a major player in a street-based drug organization. 3, have a violent criminal history. 4, recent incarceration. 5, reputation of carrying a gun. 6, recent victim of a shooting. And 7, must be between the age of 16 and 25 years. And they claim on their website that, they've reduced shootings by 30% as of 2017. I would take that somewhat with a pinch of salt. We all know shootings have like doubled in the last couple of years, but I think, a socialist state can borrow from there and start from there. The next prong is, of course, media, education, and culture. We need a media that is not valorizing war and shootings and patriarchal violence. And that will take more time, but its effects will be more far-reaching. So I've addressed the war on drugs, crimes for survival, and the next one is patriarchal violence. And of course, media and culture perhaps play the most important role in trying to curb that kind of violence. Not going to happen overnight. There is no one-size-fits-all solution here. But what this book suggests is that we need mass women's groups. And I should say here by women, we mean like trans women, everyone who identifies as femme. So these mass groups will have a quasi-state status. So they'll have the protection of the state, and they will be the leaders in determining what justice looks like for the victims of patriarchal violence. They'll center the needs of the victim in this whole process. And the solutions really could range from community exclusion to residential segregation, which today we think of as incarceration, but it would look very, very different from what we see as incarceration today. So in a socialist state, the current prisons, the entire apparatus would be dismantled because these prisons are inhumane, the way they're set up. I've spent 7 years going to prison 1 to 3 times a week, and just going there for a couple of hours and coming out, you feel like the energy sucked out of you, So these are going to be very different housing arrangements combined with intensive rehab and re-education. So in a socialist state, this type of segregation, punitive institutionalization, if you will always be the last resort. And what kinds of individuals will qualify to be there? Obviously, like I just said, like those engaging in patriarchal violence. The other category is violent counter-revolutionaries engaged in the overthrow of the new socialist government. And the vestiges of capitalism aren't going to die overnight with a new socialist state. You can be sure that far-right capitalist forces will be knocking at its door. So how do we counter revolutionary forces? Only through mass mobilization of people. And that will be the most effective defense of a newborn socialist state. The book cites Cuba as an example. In Cuba, there were committees for the defense of revolution, or CDRs. And these were founded as local organizations of everyday people working together to fight off imperialist invasion and counter-revolution from within. So at first they were armed groups, then the situation changed. They became more engaged in local self-government, enacted vaccine programs, proposed legislative reform, and so on and so forth. So too, with a socialist government in the United States, we will have our own revolutionary forces made of everyday people. And the one thing to keep in mind is that whatever the organizational form is that is going to emerge, to make and defend the revolution, it will always be and remain an organ of people power. And then the last question, when will state institutions of force and violence end? Not immediately, and nobody knows exactly when, but for thousands of years, we have existed without such special police forces. And we have to be able to imagine a world where we can go back to that. When most humans are engaged in participatory public safety, where we are living under an abundance model and not a scarcity model, where our culture has changed, it's not patriarchal and violence driven, then such a future is indeed possible, And I think one thing is for sure, the first and necessary step of getting there in the future is being able to imagine and believe in it today.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you, to my comrades here, for not just, putting together this wonderful event, but like really digging into all these topics. Like it's stuff that we really need to think about because we need to be able to build this together. So the climate crisis is one of those issues that people tend to shy away from sometimes. It feels too big, right? It feels massive. It feels like a little not quite real too. You know what I mean? It's not as tangible. It's not as visible as some of these other things. But it's really one of those things that like, well, I mean, we're all gonna die if we don't do it like pretty fast, unfortunately. Um, and it's completely possible. It is 100% possible to do this together right now and turn this all around and really save our planet. So obviously, the first thing that we need to do is end the use of fossil fuels. I can't even go on to anything else without talking about that one. That's the big guy in the room, right? So there's 3 steps to this, and Socialist Reconstruction talks about this: decommodify, decolonize, and decarbonize. The 3 Ds: decommodify, decolonize, decarbonize. So to start with demodification, of course, we are going to have to immediately seize control of all fossil fuel infrastructure, all of these companies. We need to take control of it all immediately and right away. And we need to immediately democratically plan and coordinate all production and distribution of fossil fuels. Also ending immediately, that to the military industrial complex, of course. The US military is, of course, the largest polluter and consumer of fossil fuels on this earth. And, this is going to play a huge part in how we deconstruct capitalist society and reconstruct a socialist one. So we need to end the profit motive. We have to make all energy a common resource and a public utility. And that alone is going to have a huge and immediate impact, ending many of the complicated schemes that keep us from being able to address the climate crisis under capitalism. All those little schemes that they have to like price gouge, and it's all completely arbitrary, and it's just there to literally price gouge. You know what I mean? Create false scarcity, and take every bit that we have from it, and of course prioritizing the U.S. military industrial complex before even the people's needs are met. Electricity and heat would be treated as a basic right under socialism, of course. I mean, obviously, we all know how this works right now, right? Like the fossil fuel industry. Sorry, apologize. No, never mind. All right. So moving on to decolonize, we need to acknowledge the genocide that fossil fuel use and pollution in the U.S. has, imposed upon the world through destructive industries that have devastated the environment and human health. The U.S. needs to recognize its climate debt to the rest of the world and must immediately relocate all displaced peoples and communities. And that's going to be complicated when we get into talking about environmental racism. Bianca mentioned it before. We all know that, Black communities were redlined, and people, industrial polluters, the fossil fuel industry, they recognize this, and they co-locate facilities in low-income communities and communities of color. I live in an environmental justice community myself, just south of Philadelphia in Delco, where, we're just completely surrounded by industrial polluters. We have 2 waste incinerators. We have petrochemical processing. It's the end of the Mariner East pipeline. So like all that NGLs that's being fracked out in the western part of the state is piped all the way through the state down to the bottom, right in Marcus Hook and Chester, where I live. And then it's processed and sent overseas to produce single-use plastics. So what's being fracked out in the western part of the state is not being used to power homes or public works or vehicles at all, even in the US at all. It's just being sent overseas, like I said, to produce single-use plastics that, again, are polluting the rest of the world as well. So it's really a pretty sick deal. We need to acknowledge that, and we can't just say, okay, we're going to then uproot this entire Black community and move them. That's obviously not the answer. We can't do that. But we also have to, consider climate models too. And there already are some immediate effects of the climate crisis that are making some of our communities unlivable. And we have to address that as well. Like I said, we cannot just uproot Black communities and move them. We need to uproot these industries. And there is a plan to do that. Thank you. We need to learn about indigenous agricultural practices. We need to learn from like current agricultural workers and small farmers all over the world about, you know, what are the destructive industrial agricultural practices and how can we switch to regenerative practices that really, you know, nourish the land and nourish the earth while nourishing our needs as well. It can be done. Indigenous people, you know, did it for millions of years. The people know how to work the land. You know what I mean? The people are the ones that work the land. But the agricultural practices that are being used now are not dictated by the people. They are dictated with a profit motive in mind to maximize profits. And unfortunately, that, of course, is just killing the earth. There's no nutrition left in the soil. We have to fix all that, and people know how to do it. So we need to talk to people, and we need to come up with a plan for these things. We need to study indigenous methods of water, soil, and forest conservation. We need to end overconsumption, which is a huge topic. You know, the US consumes, you know, more than twice as much as the next two biggest consumers in the world. And then all three of us, I believe it's the US, France, and Germany, consume more than the rest of the world combined. That's completely untenable. Again, a lot of the consumption in the US it's also, again, the US military industrial complex over consuming fossil fuels. You know what I mean? Like they use more fossil fuels and they of course are not expending that, all of that all of the pollution from those fossil fuels here. It is being done across the world in other places. And of course, we need to end environmental racism. The US must restore what it has destroyed and repay what it has stolen. Not just in our local communities, but across the world. Of course, we know, you know, wars have been fought over oil. Governments have been overturned for lithium. That obviously has to stop immediately. And then we need to decarbonize. How do we get away from fossil fuel use? Right? Like it's hard to imagine because all of the propaganda is telling us we can't. Day in and day out, we are told that there isn't enough solar, there isn't enough wind, there isn't enough hydro. We're sold false solutions like nuclear. People honestly believe this day and age that nuclear is a safe and regenerative energy method, and it just is not. And the capitalists are selling us these lies so that they can continue to just maximize profits. And you know, I don't get it. Like we're all on the same earth. Like they're on this sinking ship as well. Of course, you know, and then you have capitalists like Elon Musk that are telling them that it's okay. We'll just, you know, go to Mars or something like that. Like they really honestly, they really do think that is a possible solution for themselves. And that's exactly why they do things like that. It's crazy. But Larry Edwards and Stan Cox came up with a interesting and completely possible method to end fossil fuel use within 10 years. It was called the cap and adapt method, but it really should be called the cap and convert method. And that would reduce fossil fuel use 10% in the first year, 20% in the second year, 30% in the third, and so on until we're not using fossil fuels anymore. And at the same time as we're reducing fossil fuel use over the course of 10 years, we are instituting solar, we are instituting wind, we are instituting hydroelectricity, we are building the infrastructure, we are training the workers, we are dismantling the former infrastructure and building this new in its place. We are rebuilding communities, we are rebuilding climate resilient communities with, you know, riparian buffers and you know, gardens and native plants that will stop the major flooding issues that we are going to continue to have and are going to continue to get worse throughout that 10 years. Again, US workers have the knowledge. We have the power, and we certainly have the technology to make this a reality. The only thing left to do is seize power for the working class and institute these plans. I know these plans exist. I work at a liberal nonprofit, climate, institution and organization, that's what it's called. And, there are multiple plans, some developed by governments, a lot of them developed by people. Well, when I say governments, I do mean they just outsource it to people because they point me to them, they're like, okay, we would like this amount of people to get together and come up with a plan for this sub-watershed group to, protect this, stream or whatever from pollution and repair whatever damage has been done. People get together, they make these plans, and the governments are like, oh God, thank you, and then nothing. They literally put it on a shelf. I know because I'm currently trying to revive a 15-year-old watershed protection plan that my township created 15 years ago and never instituted. And now this is the only one of these sub-watershed groups within the area that doesn't have one, that doesn't even have like stewards. So these plans exist. People have created these models. All we need to do is implement them, and it's really extremely possible. People all over the world are already doing this. In Cuba, they're repairing coral reefs. In China, they are literally regrowing forests from deserts. Literally forests from deserts. It's so beautiful. The party will deploy people to go live in this remote area where there used to be a forest, and they will give them everything they need. All of the resources are centrally planned and distributed to provide these people what they need to do to literally regrow forests. We are capable of that, and that is magic. That is downright magic. You know what I mean? All we need is the power to deploy those resources ourselves. People exist all over the world that have stewarded this world for millions of years, and we need to listen to them. We need to give them the control and the power to do that. Of course, we need to stop the suburban sprawl. Like Bianca mentioned, our communities are set up to maximize profits for capitalists, not to, make things efficient for us, to make things possible for us to just get around easily and not use, personal cars to drive around. Our suburbs specifically are made for single cars, for single owner cars. Homes are made for, especially in this city, homes are made for one person, two person instead of families. Like Western culture has destroyed our families. They have told us that we need to exist outside of a family unit, single and alone, in a city by yourself with a car. You need everything. You need to consume and purchase everything that a single person needs inside of a single home. You know what I mean? When for millions of years, we lived in communities and families that shared all of these things. And this is where a lot of and I'm not saying that this is like a personal failing. Like we can't end overconsumption as individuals, but that overconsumption has been so it's just like this explosion, you know what I mean? And like people are using so much more because we've been so atomized by capitalism. And yeah, I mean, we need to rebuild that, you know what I mean? We need to rebuild communities that, are based on collective power and shared resources. We can do that. Sorry, thank you. We need to set up community councils that include residents, scientists, engineers, unionized workers, and environmentalists to oversee this process. Sorry, we need to stop the exportation of fossil fuels that are mostly used to undermine other governments or produce plastics. This would be immediate. This would automatically stop a lot of pollution here in Pennsylvania, and we could eventually dismantle the infrastructure and use as much of its remnants as possible in the construction of this green infrastructure that we need. oh gosh, we need to immediately stop incinerating trash. What the hell? Like, and we know that like the science is correct on these issues, but we're constantly sold this lie. You know what I mean? These false solutions, green capitalism. It's all bullshit. It's all just meant to keep us, consuming and not thinking about it, not thinking about the future. You know what I mean? Yeah. There's no end in sight to the capitalist consumption, and they don't see it for you either. I'm sorry, I have one more thing that I wanted to mention, and it's like slipping my mind right now. And I don't think it's gonna come back. That's okay. I've said this a couple times throughout, but like the people really do have the knowledge, we have the skills, we have the technology, we have the resources. I'm sorry, well, the resources exist. And we don't live in a society where the resources don't exist to fix these problems. We just need the power to deploy and use them. I remember what it was. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about like central planning and what that democracy, the fact that that is what democracy truly is, right? Being able to actually democratically plan how you are going to distribute resources throughout your communities. That is democracy. There does not exist a democratic method to oppose an industrial polluting facility in your neighborhood at this moment. There is no democratic recourse for people to oppose industrial polluters in their community. Like I said, I live in a place where it's 10 miles from here. You know what I mean? Y'all are getting this pollution in Philly, like the same. And it exists here too. South and Southwest Philly is also an extremely overburdened environmental racism community. There's a permitting process with the DEP, but the DEP says, well, as long as they meet the requirements, it's okay. The fossil fuel industry, all of these polluting industries set the standards themselves. Like when the EPA and the DEP, came into existence, they were like, well, we don't know how much pollution is too much. We're not scientists. We don't do fossil fuel use. You tell us how much is too much pollution. And of course, the fossil fuel industry, they're just like, the limit does not exist. And so the EPA is like, okay, no limit -1. That's how much you can pollute. I'm really serious. Like, obviously I'm being silly, but like that's really the process. They really went to the industries and had them come up with these numbers. And many of those numbers have not changed over 40, 50, 60, 70 years. And it is obviously far past time that we did that. And there are some things that we can do under capitalism to protect our communities, but we will never be able to stop the climate crisis and stop the mass genocide of people until we end capitalism, period. Like, it will not happen. So yeah, let's seize the fossil fuel industry and build some community gardens and serious green infrastructure, solar power fields. We need to dismantle these tank fields and build solar fields instead. You know what I mean? We need to build windmills instead of putting another dollar store in another Black community. Listen to people. Listen to the stewards of nature, indigenous people that have done this for millions of years. Listen to the people that have the knowledge, and make a world where we all can exist without fear of breathing in toxic pollutants every day, and where we can raise our children without fear of mass climate catastrophe ending their future prematurely. The same way as we do police in our streets. The same way as we do fear our kids getting hit by cars. I fear for my child not having a world to grow up in. You know what I mean? Dying in a mass flood from the increased amount of hurricanes that we're seeing here all the time. I'm afraid my kid is going to get cancer because we live where a place where the air is poisoned and my kid has nosebleeds every day. I'm sick of it. And so I organize. I organize with my community. I organize with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, so we can fight back and we can, build a better world for our children. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. I'm going to kick it off with a question that I think is for all of our panelists and their respective expertise areas. And I think something that's on a lot of our radars right now, which is the ways we've been hearing about the plans for the construction of a mega arena by the 76ers. And I imagine it has major implications from a city planning perspective, from a policing and public safety perspective, and from an environmental perspective. So maybe if you could chime in with, in what ways does this threaten, each of your expertise areas for the residents of Philadelphia, and what do you think the major barriers are for those of us who are trying to organize perhaps against this? And I guess we can just start.
Sure thing. Yes, the proposed stadium development in Chinatown is a huge topic right now. As I mentioned, Chinatown has been cut apart, truncated, shrunken down into a tiny little area because of a number of developments over decades and decades. So first of all, I mean, this really speaks to the issue of redlining and, sorry, what's the word? It speaks to the issue of like redlining and depriving people of resources, sticking them into a very specific area. And also it takes away the community's, sorry. It takes away the community's agency to actually decide for themselves what happens in their community. The fact that we have a stadium center in South Philadelphia that has all the infrastructure it needs. It has the parking, it has transportation to and from it. It has every single thing that it needs for a large event stadium. It already exists. Why do we need another one, and why would it be in Center City? These things, I mean, like I said, it's just completely like truncating a neighborhood. But on top of that, it's like really putting the profits over the people in the sense that, like I said, why do we need another stadium? That doesn't really make any sense. But on top of that, like, where is it going to go? There's businesses, there's homes, there's people that live right there. What is their like daily lives are going to be impacted from a transportation perspective, just from like a lot of things. And also like thinking about how housing prices and tax rates and different things can be changed because of that. So it's like effectively a community could be priced out of their place that they've lived and actually built themselves over decades of work of putting in that social development, putting in all the work to actually build a community. But it can like just completely take it away by pricing a neighborhood out, having people move out that way. Yeah, definitely a huge issue. I think the biggest thing is just the agency it takes away for people to actually democratically decide what is happening in their neighborhoods.
Yeah, just really briefly, from a public safety perspective, there will be like vastly increased surveillance because with a stadium that size, it's a huge security apparatus. There's increased police presence when there are games and such. So now this community is being much more surveilled than they were before. And there's like an immediate spike in crime when there are more police officers on the ground or security people who are snitching to police officers about stuff they think is crime. So yeah, and then there'll be the discriminatory enforcement of public like nuisance codes that are always weaponized against poor people, Black and brown people, where you have like a bunch of like white people coming in from the suburbs or out, South Philadelphia and getting really drunk and standing on cars and whatnot, which will go unchecked. And and then the POC community, as always, will be bearing the brunt of that. So.
Thank you. Well, with any like demolition and construction, you're obviously talking about a lot of particulate matter pollution being released into the air. And, the companies, the contractors that are doing this, they can tell you all that they want, that they're gonna like, spray sprayers to keep the dust down and stuff. That's what they just told me, when they were knocking down an old like factory near my house. but there was still like huge coat of like masonry dust all over my vegetable garden. So, yeah, there's obvious issues like that. Like I said, the particle matter pollution from, demolition and construction. You also have to worry about, of course, emissions from vehicles and machinery. There's everything that we do like that has consequences, environmental consequences, pollution consequences. And that's why we need to so carefully plan the way we deploy those things. You know what I mean? We all know that we do not need another 76ers stadium right now. One already exists. And then is that another, because are they going to knock down the previous one, or is this going to be another place where people drive their personal cars to and park and then overconsume plastic packaged food? You know what I mean? We're adding another huge place like this that of course is going to need parking for all of our cars. There's more. It's just, yeah, all of those little things add up so huge. Not to mention what it's going to cost for people to drive there every day for work, what it's going to cost the trucks to keep that place supplied and maintained. It's just endless pollution to this, location that doesn't need to happen at all.
I think there's a very obvious critique of capitalism that all of you have made here that probably seems like a no-brainer to most of us. But it's also clear that each of your sort of advocacy areas have been co-opted by pro-capitalist elements. So housing developers offering, token affordable housing units for 2 years, right? Or people talking about police reform and increased body cameras as a solution to, the issue of police state violence. Or of course, corporate green initiatives. And so I guess my question for you is, in each of your respective areas of work, how can we be diligent to sort of fight these forces of capitalist co-optation that are so seductive? I want everyone to read this book, but we're not there yet, and we have to fiercely guard the work that we're doing so it doesn't get watered down and sort of sanitized, by the forces in power who are very savvy and are very good at diverting our effort along the way.
Yeah, so as a city planner, I think this is something that really hits hard. I joined the field really thinking that, planning is for the public good. It's for developing communities. It's for advocating for people to be the planners of their own neighborhoods. But then as I got further and further into it, I really realized, and that the book also states very clearly that, city planning and development specifically exists to expand capital for the ruling class throughout our neighborhoods. So it's specifically, how can we make more money? Not thinking about what do people need, what do people want, but specifically, how can we make more money? That's why we have so many vacant housing units. And like you said, the same thing, the co-optation with the affordable units. Yeah, so it's like the ruling class can try to placate us and make us think that, oh, well, the issue is just affordability, and if we can get more affordable units, then the people that don't make enough money will be fine, and there won't be any more issues, right? But then, like we see with the low-income affordable housing tax credits, specifically in Philadelphia, there's no stipulation to actually keep any of the units affordable long-term. And also, this gives tax credits to developers, convincing them to come into our communities and build more houses that we don't need when there's all these vacant units, and make more money off of a system that's already overdeveloped. For example, like all the water infrastructure on the ground, it was built when there weren't 1.5 million people in Philadelphia. And so now when we're building more and more and more apartment buildings on top of each other, where the street is built to handle the water coming out of 20 houses. Now it's handling the water coming out of like 100 units in one block. All of these things, just building for profit instead of building for what we need. I think it's really easy to convince us about why development is important for all of us. It expands capital. It makes sorry. There's a really good argument for why we need to keep developing communities. They want to say we need economic development. We need to have more houses. We need to have services, etc. But if the people don't actually need those things and they need other things, what is the point of making those and making that development? Yeah, and so basically they're able to just kind of like play on this issue of us knowing we need our communities to be better, but the development and the investment that actually goes into it is not for us. It's for people to make money off of us. And I think that's really one of the biggest ways that they're able to kind of trick us around that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? If we knew how to safeguard our gains, which would be like a linear progression, and it's not, and we don't know when or where the revolution will be. But as a lawyer, I will say that, I think I went into it pretty open-eyed. Like, the law is not an agent of social change, and certainly police reform is the farthest thing from that as well. So change will come like from the streets. It's not going to come from within these institutions. All the nonprofits in the world, they're treating the symptom and not the cause. So, we're just trying to earn a paycheck. We're trying to constantly make visible the inherent contradictions in the system and its unfairness. And that is the best we can do in our professional lives as we pay our bills. And then, in our private lives and the time that we have, we are joining parties like the PSL and trying to build a groundswell of mass mobilization, because the system is the problem. Capitalism as a whole has to go. We cannot have public safety until that shit is gone. With the profit maximizing motive, will always just have people in cages. So.
Thank you. That resonated with me so well because, I do work in the nonprofit world and, specifically, working on climate issues. And I do believe, I know that it's going to take a revolution and systemic change to actually stop the climate crisis. But that also doesn't mean I'm not going to do what I can to help my community, within this capitalist system. Like I said, it's an actual life and death situation. You know what I mean? We're talking about lives here. We're talking about my family's lives. Like, you can't, I can't just walk away from that. So yeah, that's really important to me, to be able to do what I can within this system to, do something while still, on my time organizing for what it's actually gonna take. And that also helps me build my knowledge and skills for when the time comes. You know what I mean? But yeah, I mean, with the environmental stuff, we see these false solutions. The waste incineration is a perfect example. The Philadelphia Union, soccer stadium is in Chester. I know they call it the Philly Stadium, but it's in Chester, okay? And it's right next to the Covanta waste incinerator, right next to it. I mean, they put that stadium right in the whole industrialized corridor. It's insane that they did that, but they did. And Subaru, in turn, really gets excited to tell its patrons that they use the environmentally friendly waste incineration method and recycling to be environmentally and climate justice friendly. But it's actually like way worse than just landfilling the stuff, and it's literally polluting homes. I mean, it's right next to people's home and another waste incinerator where you can smell it all the time. The quality of life that you live when you live somewhere where you can smell burning trash and human waste in your home all the time, that's not a quality of life. That's really disgusting. And yet Subaru will trip over their feet to tell you about how environmentally friendly they are because they're doing the waste incineration and not landfilling stuff. Like, it's such a cognitive dissonance. You know, there's bills like Reggie, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, that I testified for at the Pennsylvania court. You know what I mean? Like, I went in there and testified about this, you know, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that would make power plants have to reduce the amount of emissions that they're polluting. It's not enough. You know, Reggie, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, would not stop people from dying from power plant pollution. It would not stop that pollution that's happening. It would lessen it a little bit, but it wouldn't stop it. But we're sold these things, and we're not just sold them like by the powers that be. We're sold them on a cultural level every day. Like when it comes to recycling, when it comes to electric cars, when it comes to, you know, all of these things, when it's environmental, we're sold them culturally, like at every level, every day. So we've got a big task ahead of us on that one. We got to build an actual culture, you know, that values actual solutions, real solutions to these problems.
Thank you. I want to see if anyone here wants to ask a question or two before we wrap up. And you can just go ahead and stand up and yell it out, and then we'll repeat it for folks.
I have a question. I'm very interested in kind of like looking at the criminal justice system and how we dismantle some of those systems of oppression. And I think like looking at kind of like emancipation, how people went from shackles of slavery to shackles of incarceration. I'm wondering how the socialist perspective, when we have this revolution and recreate ourselves, how they will avoid that and not kind of reproduce those same systems and just hide it in a different way, like we've been doing each revolution prior.
I'll just repeat the question for folks online. The question is, how will socialist reconstruction sort of not recreate the patterns of oppression in our system of criminal?
Specifically, because I think incarceration, it gives us a justified, like for example, military is murdering people, but it's justified murder. Incarceration, it's putting people in shackles, but it's justified shackles. And so in which way are we going to justify the next, which I'm hoping it doesn't, the next system of shackles? So
how does a socialist future not sort of repackage and find justifications for new systems of criminal justice sort of repression?
Yeah, no, that's a big question. And I think, you know, based on my understanding of the chapter and what my hope is that if the system is truly participatory, then it is accountable to the people, right? So when justice is being meted out, not by a judge in robes with a law school degree, but by, say, 35, 40 people in your community sitting around talking it through, going through their own mediation, then there is much more accountability and flexibility. You're not bound by like a book, a sentencing manual, and possibly like systems of appeal and like a database perhaps nationally to show who's getting what for what, you know, like how long they're in this residential segregation facility, and then having the community also then advocate for individuals to be released from the residential segregation housing based on their rehabilitation.
That's a fancy word of saying the same thing, like the residential. But I mean, I'm gonna
I think that's
a
fair.
little bit more. It's just very, like they're still separating families. I think it's still marginalized people who are not dominant in the like cultural masses are going to be looked at still as othered. And I think when you bring the community together and you have people who are not represented as much, I feel like it can.
So I do think, so the person who is being potentially restricted to this residential segregation, the folks deciding whether that person has to undergo that or not should also be strongly from that person's community as well as the victims. That's my thought. That was not explicitly addressed. Like this was, you know, it's one chapter and it was trying to cover many different things. I have thought about that. I think that's very critical. Yeah, and you know, the overarching goal is to move away from this. But to the book's point, you know, like if you look at the Russian Revolution, you look at any revolution, you're going to have right-wing capitalist insurgencies like round the clock. You're going to have to put people in residential segregation, or you're going to be naive and fail as a socialist project. So, it's hopefully an intermediate measure that the state and all of the people participating in this process has to carefully guard against. There's no guarantee that it will not reproduce the exact injustice you're saying. So,
And we have one final question. Go ahead.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Hassan Tour. Shout out to PSL for this kind of discussion, because for those of us who unapologetically identify as socialists, we need to be having these conversations more often, in particular in our religious communities where we live. Now, I'm a church sister and I'm a socialist. Back in the day, they used to call some people to raise their eyebrows, but now so many years later, they're not raising their eyebrows, but they're asking me, what am I reading and what chapter in the New Testament am I reading, right? You feel me? Okay, so for this comrade's question here about policing, I'm struggling with that too. Now, for me, as some indication, is what Cuba did in 2021 with the Communities for the Defense of the Revolution, and how they handled folks trying to take advantage of that situation. Because there were some reactionaries in that mix, whether they were prompted by the US or not, but they tried to take advantage of that situation. They were all on Twitter with their fake accounts out of Switzerland, because I found one in Switzerland. Not even Miami, they were Switzerland, right? So, how are we going to deal with that in a way that we can explain to folks? I'm struggling with that. Because for me, for some folks, if I catch you red-handed, I don't know. I mean, let's be real. But also with that, the other part, Chinatown. I was at the community meeting, comrade here, Tina, back in December. And I think when it comes to Chinatown and other things, we have to be prepared for reactionaries in our midst. If you saw the video where I spoke and I called that young brother out, right? The 76ers got this, nonprofit, and they had this young black man up there talking a bunch of stuff, and I very politely called him a sellout. Right?
Diversity officer.
Yeah, he's the diversity officer, but when it came to what he was doing is basically gentrification, he didn't really have a comment. All I'm saying here is we have to be prepared for that too. And we have to be very, very tight on our political education. That means sometimes some reactionary folks can be in your family and they try to clown you somewhere, and you may have to put grandma in check. I mean, seriously, we really have to think about that. Right? Because everybody ain't down. So that's what I'm struggling with. So anyone can address that.
So yeah, Asantua asked, as always, brilliant question, two-part question, sort of really about how we intend to deal with reactionary forces, anticipate them, and deal with them sort of systematically as they arise. And then we'll.
Sure, thank you. I think a lot of this it's a lot about like how we need to change our culture, like at every level, you know what I mean? And this is already happening a lot, you know what I mean? Like we've come so far, really. Not on obviously like a huge, like it's not happening like in like capitalist culture, but like in our communities, I can see the culture changing. I know you can too, you know what I mean? And we need to like excel that. We need to like keep that, and we need to seize it, control it, and make it stronger. You know what I mean? Like we have to build a culture of accountability so that when our neighbors, express these views or are involved in a crime and come before their community, to decide what to do, your community now has built this culture of true accountability, of true care, of true collaboration, and are able to then empathetically really come together to decide what the best course of action is. And that's, in the capitalist system, of course, it's incarceration. In the socialist system, that's not going to be our first thing. You know what I mean? We're going to do community counseling. We're going to make sure that like needs are met. we're going to make sure, that we can get through these issues. You know what I mean? That we can, show grandma that like, yeah, it used to be like that, grandma, but like we're doing shit different now. You know what I mean? Like, and let's get you on board. But seriously, like we need to stop consuming capitalist culture because it is always going to individualize and separate us to the point where these reactionary views exist, to the point where, people commit crimes that take them to incarceration. We need to end that. And we do that by building our own culture, our own working class culture of collaboration and care and revolutionary love and optimism. And that is how we change things. We change hearts, we change minds, and that's how you change behaviors.
One of the things that jumps out at me reading this book and hearing the panelists is that this is not an abstract exercise we're engaging in. We think this is absolutely imminent. This program that's laid out and that we've been discussing is right around the corner. And we're ready for it, and we're getting ready for it. And so, I think that's a really important start to this conversation is like, okay, well, we have just around the corner a revolutionary situation, right? And how will we prepare for it? So these questions all speak to that. All of our panelists' comments speak to that. And it's so exciting to see you all here to join us in this conversation. If you're interested in the PSL or the Philly Liberation Center, please talk to any one of us. There's a whole bunch of party members here as well. We can tell you about the various projects we work on and how you can support us. Obviously, find us on social media. And it's been a real pleasure chatting with all of you today. So we can close there. And thanks again, and take care.